Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. The topic is budget cuts at Mānoa. We're talking about the university, of course. We have two guests with us, Richard Nettel, Assistant Professor of English, and he is also on the UPA board and on the Executive Committee of the UPA, which is University of Hawaiʻi Professional Assembly, and Noel Kent, he's a Professor of Ethnic Studies. So welcome to you both. And I thought that before we start our discussion, we go to a segment from an interview I did with Gerard Russo, who is the chairman of the economics department at Mānoa. And I asked him about the financial crisis that we are facing in the U.S. and how it impacts Hawaii, so we can frame the discussion for the budget cuts that we will be discussing. So we'll be watching that and then discussing.
As everyone knows, I mean, we're having the worst financial crisis probably since the Great Depression in the U.S. Banking industry. It's really quite a worldwide meltdown. It's severely started in September. Hawaii was not a big participant in the high-risk mortgage market, and our own financial institutions were not poorly managed. However, the overall macroeconomic economy for the United States and the world is going into a severe recession associated with this financial meltdown, other factors as well. And so we're being indirectly affected in a very strong way. The economy is extremely dependent on tourism and other exchanges with the world economy, particularly California and Japan. So we're heading into a deep recession, the state is. It's likely that tourism is down 20%. Tax receipts will be, for the state, excise tax receipts will be way down. Income taxes will be down. It's going to be very, I think, difficult for the state to balance its budget. So 2009 will be worse than 2008. The most severe part of the economic downturn has not occurred yet. So it'll really exhibit itself more in the next calendar year and the next fiscal year. So all the state agencies are going to be severely affected, unlike the national government, which can run huge deficits and finance it with dollar expansions. States and local governments are constrained, and in Hawaii, in fact, they're required to run a balanced budget. So the university is going to suffer, I think, cuts. Our situation is a little less severe than other state agencies because we're not 100% dependent on G funds. One thing I think you've probably noticed in the fall was that the enrollment is up in the system, although pretty much flat on the Manoa campus. And university education tends to be counter-cyclical. That is, people go back to graduate school or stay in school longer when the job market isn't good. So they invest in their education, and then when the economy recovers, they'll be able to get better positions. So there's about, I think, 53,000 students. So tuition dollars are going to, I think, continue to be strong, and the university continues to be even more dependent on that. And I think research dollars will continue to be strong, particularly, I think, with the new administration in Washington, D.C. National Institutes of Health and other funding agencies will be providing the university with continued stream of funds. So those offset, the tuition dollars and the research monies are going to offset the G fund downturn, but it's still going to hurt. So we're going to be subject to budget cuts throughout the system. And Manoa being very large, 20,000 of the 53,000 students, is likely to feel some very severe cuts. It's going to be difficult to hire faculty and staff, and it's going to be quite a bit of belt tightening, and equipment replacement and other things are going to be difficult to do during this period. And it's likely to get worse. And how bad, I don't think we completely know at this point.
Well, so here's a grim picture. So, we're gonna be cut, I suppose. Well, not I suppose, I know. because we already planned for a 5% cut, at the College of Social Sciences, and I'm sure other colleges as well have planned for that. And there's another 5% coming also. That's for next fiscal year. So 10% next fiscal year so far. It could go up to 20%. And there may be more cuts for this ongoing fiscal year. So what are your comments? Richard, I'm interested to see how you think about the budget cuts and your comments about them.
Well, I think one of the issues is the usual one. How will these budget cuts affect faculty primarily? And of course, we have a contract at the moment which ensures that there is a certain orderly way that we would progress. So obviously, people with tenure are safe. But a lot of the teaching that is done by lecturers, instructors, and obviously GAs too, that will be the first to go. So there will be a large cut, presumably, precisely at the weakest, the most vulnerable, the ones that don't have protections of tenure. The other thing, of course, is that we generally address these issues by cutting everyone equally. You talked about 5%, 10%, maybe even a 20%. No one really has the courage, maybe, to take more, what shall we say, vital decisions as to which programs perhaps warrant continued funding. These are questions that none of us want to deal with, but the overall bleeding every program by 15, 20% possibly seems to be not particularly a progressive way to move forward, and I think we need to consider exactly what sort of higher education system the state can afford, even in good times, but particularly in bad times.
Yeah. So let me follow up with that. In terms of UPA, have you folks discussed any kind of preliminary issues as regards this matter of budget cuts? Also, in terms of dealing with the university, have you been talking with some officials, administrators?
Directly on the budget cuts, the administration, I don't think, has sought too much input from the union. However, we are currently in negotiations for a new contract. Our current contract, 6-year contract.
Yeah, and you are on the negotiating committee.
I'm on the negotiating team, yes, of the committee.
OPA.
Yeah, and those are still ongoing, although not much progress can be reported. But what is interesting at the moment in terms of the budget cuts is that we have a 6-year contract that is due to expire in June 2009. We are currently attempting to negotiate a new contract for the next biennium, which will be the next 2 years through 2011. But as I'm sure you know, the governor has asked all public sector unions to agree to roll over the current contract for, well, she says 1 year. It may be more than 1 year because we normally work on a biennial process. So no one's talking about what will happen in the dead year, the second year. The advantage of that for the faculty would be that at least we have a contract that we can refer to, which has, over the last 6 years, I mean, the contract has positive language, so we would have a contract. But of course, the negative will be that there will be no salary increases, and well, as the last interview said, it will be harder to recruit and retain faculty and provide the sort of quality education that we need at a university of this, stature.
Right. And Noel, what are your views on this matter?
Well, I'm not terribly happy. None of us are really happy about this. We've never been an institution, and I've been here over 30 years, that has been adequately funded. So it's not like we're cutting away massive amounts of fat. This is a bone and muscle that we're looking at this point. So that's a real problem. My concern is really with the faculty, but it's also with the students, because I think the students are the ones who are really going to suffer here. We're already in a situation where they just can't get the classes they need. They can't. People aren't graduating in the time they want to graduate in, and it's going to become more and more difficult, as time goes on. So That's a real concern. And if enrollment does rise during this period, we're not going to have adequate resources to deal with that and to take care of. We want to give everybody, the students deserve a quality education here.
Sure.
And if we can't do that, then that's a real problem.
Yeah, so that's the contradiction here.
Yeah.
But I interviewed Edward Schultz, interim dean of School of Pacific and Asian Studies. But he was talking about the cuts and that we have to sustain some cuts. So we'll watch that segment and then we go from there.
It's quite obvious there's going to be cuts, and now the question is, what's the percentage? We've been told anywhere between 5 to 10 to 20%. We had a report, we meaning the deans had a report from a member of the economics department about a month ago, and they predicted it could go as high as 40% loss of revenue for the state, which would play directly into what we do here at Mānoa. We've already felt the cuts. For example, Center for Korean Studies has to hire, their secretary is retiring, and so we put in a request to hire a new secretary, and all civil service personnel hires have been frozen. So the Center for Korean Studies, which is one of our hallmarks on this campus, a building that's used quite actively, may not have a secretary, which will seriously affect the ability of the university to bring programs into that center. That's just one example of things that are coming right now. But the big crunch will begin next July. And that's where we're trying to figure out how to guard against totally eviscerating our programs. SPAS, School of Pacific and Asian Studies, is a little luckier than other organizations because we do have significant federal money coming in. We have a budget of roughly $3 million. We're kind of small and lean. The federal government probably gives us about $1.5 million a year for different programs, scholarship programs, research programs, outreach programs. And so that's helping us limp through this next year or so. We also are fortunate because we do have endowments, especially in Korean studies and Japanese studies. And that should hopefully take up the slack. We're going to encourage all our faculty to go on sabbatical and half pay, but unfortunately that's not going to happen because all our faculty have just come off sabbatical, so we're going to have to pay full wages for them. But essentially, what will happen if the cuts become, say, at 20%, we'll have to seriously cut back what we give our centers for support. And I would predict student help would have to be a thing of the past. Lecturers would have to be a thing of the past. We have to seriously contemplate asking our faculty for the duration of this downturn, perhaps to increase their teaching load. And so these are all different kinds of scenarios we have to talk about. We've also talked about, I don't know if this should be public, but the deans have talked about taking a 5% cut in their salaries as one way to help alleviate the hardship. We've also talked about asking everybody to take 1 day of leave without pay. And if we did that across the system, that would be a significant cut. Usually, if you come into this office, the lights are off because this is a fairly sunny office, so I don't need to keep the electricity on. But today it was really dark, and I really couldn't quite see the keyboard, so we had to. Now the sun's come in, so I can turn the lights off. But I mean, there's lots of different small ways which we can begin to try to cut as well.
Yeah, so another grim picture, just like the economy, in terms of real cuts. I mean, if you talk about lecturers being cut, maybe student assistants, maybe GAs and all that kind of thing, it's really, very serious. Are they planning for cuts in such a real negative or adverse economic environment? But I'm wondering, people say that economists say that, in the next couple of years or so, it's going to get better after 2 years. So what would happen? They will reinstitute those things or what? Or is this a situation where they're taking advantage of this kind of economic situation to really downsize the university? I mean, that's, I think, the larger picture of that. So I don't know what views you have about that, if that's what you think, or...
That's what I think, definitely. There was, we have Chancellor Hinshaw here has indicated even before the crisis that basically she'd like to shrink the faculty and shrink the programs, and she, in a conversation with her last year, she talked about doing better with less. Of course, we've been doing better with less for so many years. It's a little absurd at this point, but that's one of my fears, that this economic crisis will be used to shrink the faculty, shrink the student body, and to basically undermine certainly undergraduate education at Mānoa, and I think that's a real blow to the young people in Hawaii.
Yeah. Incidentally, I want to say that I sent an email to Chancellor Hinshaw to have an interview with Russo and Schultz. She later on, after a long while, I think she was traveling, said that she was busy, so she couldn't meet with me. But she said that through UH Relations, Greg Takayama sent me an email saying that the Chancellor apologizes that she couldn't be on the show, as for an interview, etc. So because I wanted to also hear what she had to say, but also she's on record in terms of what she's saying, and one of the things is that what you just mentioned as well, in terms of cuts and so on, even before the onslaught of the economic onslaught and financial onslaught that we're facing now. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
At the risk of being provocative,
yeah,
let me say that if we're making cuts at this point, I really think we should look at the administration as a prime area to cut. Right now, we're talking about cutting faculty, cutting student help, cutting various programs. Hinshaw's own, we never had a chancellor here for a very long time, and we did perfectly well, and we carried on with our work. It's a very costly office. It's an extra layer of bureaucracy. Many of us thought a good reason to have that office is because it would protect our campus in terms of vis-a-vis the other campuses in the system, but that really hasn't happened. So I, for one, would be very, very willing to see us close down the Chancellor's office and direct that money toward instruction and toward student support and all kinds of other things. And he also mentions cutting salaries. A number of presidents in other universities have basically cut their salaries substantially. And we have a president who makes $414,000 plus free housing and this and that. I don't see why we can't, a considerable amount of that can't be returned to the university.
Yeah, well, I agree totally with what Kent is saying and what he said before about there not being much fat to cut. And I think on the instructional side, that is certainly true, because you guys have also been around long enough to know that this is not the first time we've faced these cuts, and we have been forced to make do with a lot less repeatedly.
Yeah, now that you said it, let's go to a segment from Jerry Russo's interview, and he was talking about exactly that. So we'll watch that and then we'll go forward.
2 years ago, on the chair of the Arts and Science Faculty Senate Executive Committee, at a time when there was a discussion about reorganizing. And I think this goes back to the Englert administration and the Conan administration as chancellors, and has continued on under our new Chancellor Hinshaw. The arts and sciences has been viewed as a trouble spot by the Mānoa administration because many of our WASC-like indicators are poor on this campus. Graduation rates, retention rates, years to graduation, and so forth. Those performance indicators have been poor. And the lion's share of students are in arts and sciences, okay? And all the undeclared students were in arts and sciences. And that was viewed as the undergraduate programs were not well managed, and those students were not served. I'll give you an example. I was teaching a freshman class and ended up with a 6-year student in my class several years ago and I asked her, this student, what are you doing? And her response was, I don't know. And I said, well, don't you have a major? No, I haven't figured out what I want to major in. And so I think that was symptomatic of a larger problem on the campus with the undergraduate programs. And so they did reorganize the associate dean's position in the arts and sciences and took many of the apparatus that were handling the undergraduate programs and moved it into the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs office. So a partial reorganization has been done. It was thought, I think, at the time that the 4 colleges of the arts and sciences would devolve into their separate units, and there would no longer be a unified arts and sciences. And each of those 4 colleges would be responsible for advising their students and progressing them through the programs at a proper rate. And now I think we've seen a change in that trend where instead of devolving and separating the arts and sciences, it's going to be consolidated into a single unit. And so that's the current proposal from the Mānoa administration.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, we tried several things before, right? I mean, so it's interesting about that. Any comments on that?
Well, you know, to get back before, I mean, obviously he's talking about increased need for counselors, student services, and this is something that we do need for the protection of the students. It is a very complicated, increasingly complicated journey through the university. But in terms of the increased cost of higher education, most people in the general public think this is the professors, the driving force. And I think, you know, Noel's point is well taken. If we look across the country, university presidents, not only ours, have seen massive, in the 35–40% range, salary increases over the last 4 or 5 years. And in addition, what he was saying about Hinshaw's appointment as chancellor here, and of course then the chancellors that are appointed at all the other campuses, you know, we've now got a whole new level of administration in the system, which is, you know, very expensive. And I think, you know, for people on the outside, they generally think it's the professors that is, you know, when we're talking about the cost of education. The other thing I would like to say is that, you know, doom and gloom aside, the university has a certain degree of autonomy. I mean, we mentioned here G funds, general funds that obviously fund salaries, but the university in the last contract agreed to take over a certain percentage of our salary increase. I believe it was 3%. So those funds are already part of the university's overall budget from whatever sources they get them from, right? And I think that as far as the faculty is concerned, I mean, the one thing that Ned Schultz says, you know, we're asking people to do this, that, and the other, take a day without pay and all the other things. I mean, one of the things I'd say is faculty should just say no. I mean, these are the things that we should not be doing, and we should be asking the university to, you know, prioritize how the money is spent. If we need money to retain faculty, good faculty, if we need to be able to retain lecturers and instructors so that they can continue to teach the many sections and help the many students, particularly at the undergraduate level, then the sort of money that is available, this 3% that's paid the salaries, you know, the university should be willing to spend. And actually the union had been hopeful until very recently that, you know, these negotiations for a 2-year contract could in fact take place. Unfortunately, it seems that just recently I heard that the governor has sort of vetoed that notion that any of the public sector unions will be allowed to have a 2-year contract. But I'm saying that, you know, there is, you know, money. It's depending on how we want to spend it. And I think the problem is we get sort of caught up in this notion. And I think, you know, maybe the governor is on that. You know, when she was running for re-election, of course, the economic times were seen as very positive, even though I believe the downturn probably had started by the
Yes.
time that she was running. Now, for some strange reason, it's politically in her interest or other people's interest to talk about the negatives. And I would suggest that, given the autonomy of the university, maybe we could still use the funding that we have. As we talked about before, there are increased tuition. Tuition is good. In a downturn, more people actually go to university to retool for when the economic situation improves.
Yeah, and in fact, like the governor sent business people, including Chancellor Henshaw, sent her a memo talking about her 5-point plan. A lot of that is tax cuts for corporations and so forth to try, and reinvigorate the economy and so on. But this kind of neoliberal technique or tactic or strategy, whichever, of really reinvigorating the economy has been tried before. I mean,
down. Ultimately,
yeah,
the
trickle down.
university
Yeah,
is
right.
what we really need to invigorate the economy.
absolutely.
That's right, because the university is a big player in the economy. Even
and
though
it benefits everyone in a way that the trickle down from tax
that's right.
cuts doesn't.
Yeah, even though that the university is not a going concern, as the governor's memo to Virginia Henshaw, indicates. She addressed her in a sense, because this is for business. These 5 points were for business. She addressed her as though she was like a business leader. There are some aspects of the university that are
Business
business,
model,
of course, but the fact of the matter is that we are not a business, we are not a going concern, and she is not a CEO of a business. Unless, of course, they want to, in time, privatize the university or privatize a lot of things at the university, then maybe, that memo would make sense in terms of like projecting forward. But the fact of the matter that there are all these cuts, tax cuts for businesses, is something that would deplete the revenues. That's one thing that we should think about in terms of looking at the overall state economy, especially in terms of state budget and so on. The other thing is that, for instance, an example, Hawaii Tourism Authority. Some people think that we shouldn't have a Hawaii Tourism Authority. But, this, what I'm saying is blasphemy to people in business in Waikiki and other places. But we should have like a real debate about those kinds of things. I mean, because it's not looking at the university only, but looking at the state's economy. And let's have a debate about that and see where it goes. Let the unions be part of that debate. Let, Local 5, for instance, should be part of that debate. The ILWU, all those kinds of players in the economy should be there, and the university would be part of that because we're a big engine for the economy here. So depleting the university in the short term might be counterproductive, it seems to me.
And definitely in long term. I mean, basically, we are the long-term engine in the sense of if we're ever going to move anywhere. And, providing a subsidy, the recent subsidy to Hawaii Tourism Authority, I mean, one really has to really wonder about that. That's highly questionable.
That's right. Yeah. And we know what happened with the Hawaii Tourism Authority, and anyway, Johnson's the Johnson part. But anyway, let's not talk about this because it took them a long time to deal with it. Although it could have been just like a quick thing. He did that; he should be out. Period. But
and we should look at this crisis as an opportunity. I mean, to do for new departures and new policies, and to rationalize what we're doing and do it better in a certain sense. We've got a $21 million electric bill every year. I mean, if we could shave that in half, that gives us $10 million more to devote to real education. Right. I mean, that should be the priority that we're looking at.
Right, and the university here is looking at that, like going green and all that things. We're going to institute about the December 24th to January 4th, we're going to institute a voluntary kind of shutdown of air conditioning and so on. Yeah. But you know,
but that's gonna,
no. I know. But the thing is that that's not going to help. I mean, this is not a structural thing. It will help a little bit, but
it will
not.
help,
Yeah.
and I agree that we should be, you know, addressing
Right.
those issues. I don't think it's enough, but you know, I'd just like to say, I mean, we do waste an inordinate amount of electricity.
Yeah.
I mean, I fail to see why we have the air conditioning set so low that faculty have to have heaters in their office to compensate for it. I mean, these things are ridiculous, and we should be moving. And but the sustainability movement on campus is at least a step in the right direction, and we will be able to make substantial savings. But you know, these are different from the fundamental issues about you know, how we value you know, higher education and the need for higher education and quality higher education. These others, I think, you know, are going to be very helpful, and I would like to see us not only in terms of cash, but also as a commitment to the environment, that we change some of our practices, as people should across the state.
Right, right.
But you know, the fundamental question is, you know, in times of a crisis, how do we respond in terms of how we view higher education? And I think Noel is exactly right. We have to sort of think carefully about the priorities, what needs to be done, and we may have to take some bolder decisions.
Yeah. And as a community.
Right.
As a community.
Right. That's why.
Not with a top-down sort of directive.
Right.
This is what you do, but basically
we
with
should be
a dialogue.
We should be involving all the players. Right.
Yeah.
And we have not had that.
And
so far it's been top-down.
interesting that the university here and other universities in the U.S. talk about freedom and democracy and criticize other countries or states about, you know, authoritarianism and so forth. And what are we experiencing, you know, is that top-down kind of thing. And pretenses about really listening to, you know, the stakeholders like faculty, students, etc., but not really, you know, and that is troubling, you see. And anyway, so this has to be, this kind of thing needs to be resisted, it seems to me. Yeah. Well, anyway, I want to go to a segment from Ned Schultz. He is talking about, okay, you know, cuts. So how do you go about doing cuts, for instance? So we'll watch that and then.
Well, what sort of courses are you teaching? What sort of money are you bringing in? How productive are your faculty in terms of scholarship? How good are your graduates? How quickly are you getting your students through? These are questions that, you know, we have to raise and see how it falls. It's very clear the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa has a mandate to excel in Pacific and Asia, and we bring in significant money every year because of our Pacific and Asia programs. So if you're confronted with, say, a fourth-year French class that has 10 students, or a fourth-year Thai class that has 5, what do you fund? And luckily that isn't my problem, it's poor Dino Mealy's problem. But from my perspective, you really have to look at how important it is to have Thai speakers, especially given the problems going on in Thailand right now. And it's a burden, it's an expense, but that's sort of a commitment the university has made. And although those French students would probably be up here boycotting my office if they hear this, I would give the priority to the Thai, because that's our kuleana. That's what we've said we want to make our name in. You can study French almost any place,
but not Thai.
But not here. You can't study Thai. There's maybe 5 universities in the country that have fourth-year level Thai. I mean, why do we have in this state a Center for Philippine Studies, a Center for Okinawan Studies? It's because that's what our community wants. And this is a public university. And Hawaii's made its name, it's made its reputation off of being a Center for Pacific and Asian Studies, as well as Hawaiian Studies.
Yeah, so like Ned Schultz is talking about how complicated it is to really cut one. And also, if you really want to cut, you have to look at what is important for the University of Hawaii, for Hawaii, what are the commitments of, you know, the strategic plan and so forth, you know, in terms like diversity, a question of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multinational society, you know, the question of have excellence in Asia-Pacific region in terms of programs and so forth. So all these might militate against like just looking at numbers and say, okay, there are 3 people here in this class, so let's cut it, and there's 20 people here, let's fund it. But maybe that is more important than the 20 students who can like go and study French, as the example is, somewhere else, you know, pick up a book and do it. You cannot like do it as easily with Thai, for instance, or Chinese, Mandarin, or whatever, you know. So these are the kinds of things that need to be taken into account. And any kind of discussion about budget cuts, etc., should not lose sight of the commitments that University of Hawaii has made for Asia Pacific and the multi-ethnic, multinational society here. Okay, so that's what I just wanted to say. So any other comments on that?
Not on that, but what really concerns me about these cuts are the liberal arts. You know, and I think that's what's really under the gun, because the professional schools like business, some of the other schools are well funded, they have outside funding and that sort of thing, and we really don't. And I think liberal arts are really at the foundation of this university. I mean, basically we're trying to create a student body that's liberally educated in the best sense of the word, that can really think creatively, and we're going to really desperately need those people in the future in Hawaii and you know, worldwide. And I think this crisis may be used as an opportunity for those who would like to dismantle or diminish liberal arts as a way of doing that. And that's what really concerns me. I think there's some hidden agendas out there in the Chancellor's office and other places to really go after liberal arts and to increase the clout and the power of the professional schools. And that's a real fear.
I mean, you can be a good MD, excellent MD, for instance, but maybe you not very good in other matters, you know, I mean, social issues, etc., that are really critical, you know. So the MD or the engineer or the accountant have to be educated in terms of looking at liberal arts education, etc. This should be at the core. And there is a commitment to that in some quarters, but perhaps in such adverse economic times, that kind of commitment vanishes or disappears or fades away to the benefit of you know, the professional schools. And that would be really something that would dumb down, regardless of the high technical skills of people who graduate from those professional schools, would dumb down the educational level of people who are maybe part of the intelligentsia as doctors, engineers, and so forth. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think there's 2 things to say about that. The first is clearly that we have the system here where we are cutting, as Ned Schultz said, we are cutting in the sense that for the dean, the easiest thing to do is to raise caps. And so by saying that now we are going to require a 12-student minimum for the class to take place means clearly that if you're one of the 10 that have signed up, you know, you don't get that class.
Right.
Now, this is again, I think, what we talked about before, which is sort of cutting everybody sort of equally. It's the easy way around, but it avoids some of the, you know, big decisions that have to be taken in terms of priorities. But of course, once you start talking about, you know, our position in the Pacific as being a priority, there's always going to be someone else whose area is important to them. And as we said, the problem with all of the liberal arts education is you can't get too much in the way of outside funding. So you are dependent much more on what the university can provide. I mean, it's not critical thinking. There's not too many major corporations presumably willing to donate that sort of money.
Yes.
Even though they would benefit from it, especially now.
Especially now. And the other thing is as well that I wanted to say, and which makes our situation, I think, at the university also very different maybe from other places, is that, you know, we're caught in a sort of a tripartite discussion group. There's, well, at least the faculty and the councillors, all those represented by UPA on the one hand with the contract. And then we have the university that we tend to talk to directly, but then we've got downtown. And downtown is, a big player here, the governor particularly at the moment, but also, in the ledge. And so one of the things that we've also got to think about, maybe in these times of crisis, is, the ledge, the people there represent certain districts, and they have certain interests that they represent, and they have certain projects that they're in favor of. We might talk about the pharmacy school in Hilo, or we might talk about West Oahu, for example. Now, personally, I'm in favor of higher education. I think education is a human right, and I would like to see more of it for everyone, and I would like to see, if anything, the quality of it improve. But one of the things that the state is clearly not thinking enough about is what sort of investment this education would take and how much the state is prepared to pay at the moment. So it seems to be on the same system as, drawing lines in the sand and saying you've got to have 12 students in a class, this sort of easy way of making sorts of cuts. On the other hand, we've got an extension of the university with pressure from downtown this way. We're going to build new buildings, we're going to build new campuses, we're going to extend new campuses. And yet, very little discussion about long-term, are we going to fill these places with quality people providing the quality education? And I think the crisis may require us to actually have some, maybe painful to some, but discussions about, what we can actually afford within the sorts of resources that an island state of this size has.
Yeah, how would you recruit faculty to teach in that expansive horizontal thing? I mean, we have lost a lot of good faculty here over the years because of some unwise decisions in terms of, especially in the 90s, right? Budget cuts and all that kind of stuff.
And the overall cost of living and the other disadvantages that we have here.
And housing, housing support is not really there for faculty, etc. Anyway, so that's what is interesting. I asked Ned Schultz also about cuts across the board versus vertical cuts and so on. So let's see what he has to say, and then we go from there. More cuts to come.
And we need to have that discussion. Your dean, Dubanowski, is always saying, let's talk about what we feel is important. Where should our priorities rest? And then make the economic decisions based upon our priorities. And we haven't done that. And so I fear that when this round of cuts, and we'll probably know better in a couple of months exactly how much our budget's going to be cut in the spring, or starting next year. And I fear it's probably just going to be across the board because we haven't done the preparations we need to do. And also, I think before you would do that, you'd have to make sure you've taken every measure you can to prevent that from happening. And that would entail, as I say, maybe asking our faculty to teach more, asking ourselves to maybe even, take a salary cut.
Yeah, so like he's mentioning, like before you cut vertically, you gotta figure out, you have to have debate and see what priorities there are, etc. And this is like a long-term thing. It doesn't happen like, okay, we want it by next week. It doesn't work out that way. I mean, you have to have like some time to really have the debate go and so on. So it's gonna take a long time. Meanwhile, as somebody said, I think Jerry Russo in another segment, meanwhile, the crisis will have elapsed, and we'll go back to, our old ways, so to speak. And then you will cut, and then you will regret that you have cut things. So it will be unwise given that kind of scenario. So it's really something. Yeah. Any other comments on?
But I'm just going back to this West Oahu, which has been bothering me for years. I mean, the very notion, even in prosperous times, of building a major campus on a small Pacific island 15 miles away from another major campus. I mean, I could see West Oahu as a nice small college, as a place which emphasizes certain types of selective excellence. That would be wonderful. I've given some lectures there. I really appreciate the student body, many of whom are older people who are really, desperately trying to get an education. Many of them have single moms, that sort of thing. And I think they're terrific people. But we don't have the resources in this state, especially in 2008, to support two major campuses, which are really close to each other. I think West Oahu needs to be limited to a nice small size, perhaps 1,500, perhaps 2,000. The current projections are for about 7,000 or 8,000. That's going to absorb tremendous resources, which are going to come from Mānoa, Hilo, and the other schools. And in fact, I would propose that that the rest of the system establish a kind of united front against West Oahu to basically limit the kind of economic damage it's going to do to us.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure that I would want to put it necessarily in those terms. And I'm sure our colleagues at West Oahu have been, long dreaming of this new campus. The campus wouldn't be too happy to hear it. But I do think that we need a sort of open discussion about where the additional funding is going to come from, so that we can support this campus with the sort of resources. Again, it's not just the faculty and the counselors and the librarians, but I presume there will be another large layer of administration that will go on top of it. All those things we have to think very carefully about. And I think, again, with the tripartite division, that looks a lot easier maybe from downtown, because everybody in Capital A would like to be able to avoid the commute to Mānoa.
Yeah, that's a major point. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, to what extent, the other players here have really, become involved in rationally. I mean, that's a sort of a political decision, but it may not be one that, given the circumstances we have at the moment, because, as Nettel says, the alternative is these sort of across-the-board cuts, draining things away, so that when the situation improves in 2011, somehow we can slowly begin to regain the lost ground. But in the meantime, the money will presumably be gone to administration or whatever, and the quality of the education, is always being diluted. And I think this is the problem. If it's being diluted already, how will introducing an alternative large campus not dilute it further if the resources are not available? I think these are discussions, at least, again, I think it comes back to your excellent point earlier, all stakeholders need to be involved in a discussion about, what is good in terms of higher education for this state, for our people. And until that discussion takes place, it's a little bit like the rail debate. Obviously people over in Kaneohe are not too keen on the rail debate. Well, it's the same is true, maybe for people in Kapolei who want the Kapolei campus, which I can perfectly understand. But, do they really fully understand what the bill, who's going to be paying, and is the state committed equally to funding a quality university, because we want our higher education to be a quality education, in a new campus. And I think, maybe we would have these debates, but my experience, which is not as long as yours at UH, but would suggest to me that, in fact, we won't have these debates, we won't have these discussions. No. We'll settle for, the bleeding of the 5, 10, 15, even 40%, and we'll hope that, Brubaker and all these people are correct, and 2011 we won't have to worry about cuts anymore. But ultimately we will have been cut. Yeah. The teaching side will have been cut, because those salaries are not increasing. If we look over the years that I've been here, we've more or less been at inflation or below, whereas other segments of the universities, we've said before, like administration, have seen real-term increases that way beyond the cost of the instruction.
Yeah. I can remember a few years ago there was a man named Mortimer who was president. He was making $160,000. Today we have someone who's making $500,000. I mean, where does this come from?
Plus a chancellor.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me do this. I want to go to the reorganization in light of these budget cuts and so forth. So I interviewed Schultz, and he was talking about the reorganization. And then also Russo talks about the reorganization. So we'll first play Schultz, come back, and then go to Jello Russo, so we can juxtapose them together, and then, we'll have a discussion.
When the chancellor called for reorganization almost a year ago, never once did she mention this was to save money. The whole purpose behind reorg is to put the liberal arts at the center, at the heart of the campus. There's sort of a feeling that our students come in largely unengaged, and they leave largely unengaged. Now there's some students who come in and they capture the beauty of Manoa right off the bat and really excel. But probably the majority just kind of pass through. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we get these students better generated? How do we make the liberal arts, you know, the sciences, the fine arts, the performing arts, the literature, history, everything that you and I sort of see as being the heart of the university, how do we recenter it and make it the heart of the university? So that was the idea behind reorg. And there was the sense that there was no really one strong spokesperson for the liberal arts. Right now you have 4 arts and science deans, and you have 1 dean of Pacific and Asian studies. And the feeling was that maybe they don't have the clout that one super dean, one real strong dean would have. Because if you bring the arts and sciences together, you've probably got at least a third to maybe half of the university in that one college. And that certainly would give it a much higher profile. That's the rationale behind this. There was also a feeling that arts and science, because of its lack of focus at the top, was failing, for example, in the advising of students, the mentoring of students, getting students into programs, getting students to understand why they're there and what they're doing. The faculty in Pacific and Asian studies are quite concerned about the reorg. They fear that bringing Pacific and Asian studies into the larger College of Arts and Sciences may water down its program. It may cause its focus to become less vital.
Yeah, so that's like one view in terms of the reorg, etc., at least how it was, envisioned earlier, or in the beginning. But let's go to Jerry Russo's view about the reorg. We play that and then we come back.
I think in order to attract the best talent to take on the position of Dean of the Arts and Sciences, you'd have to provide resources. Anyone who comes into the job would not want to come into a financial crisis. So the most highly qualified candidates would want to receive resources in order to execute a vision that they would see for the arts and sciences. So I think it's going to be very difficult to recruit someone under these conditions, unless you provide them with a lot of resources to do it. But it's hard to see where those resources would be forthcoming. So I would be pessimistic about the opportunity to recruit a world-class dean for the arts and sciences, and I think it would be a mistake to put anyone second-rate in that position.
He's talking about some practical problems with the reorganization. I mean, it might be defeating the purpose that it is intended to do. I want to do one thing, with your permission, is to go to another segment, a quick one, less than a minute, from Jerry Russo as well. And that deals with the question of program reviews and their importance to looking at priorities for cuts and so forth.
So I think these program reviews are happening at a time that's very crucial. This is the social sciences, which is under review. So this is I think a critical time. I don't think it's a time to be reorganizing. I think it's the last activity we should be doing at this point, because it's likely to be very expensive. I'm not sure what the WASC response is going to be to these. There's not much faculty support right now for the reorganization, and I think there may be issues of governance which appear in the WASC review that are going to be critical of the current administration.
Yeah, this is one of the questions I asked, in our college, about what would the Western Association for School and Colleges, who gives accreditation to in this case the social sciences, would say about the question of budget cuts and accreditation and how much resources you're going to put to improve the quality of education and so forth. So this is one point that Jerry is raising, that this reorganization, given these times, is not a good idea at all. Yeah. So any other questions on that?
I was on the committee, the transition committee,
Yes.
that was involved in all this, and that at the very end, the last meeting we had, basically what I said was there's been no compelling reason to have a super dean. Nobody has ever argued for that. Why are we having a super dean? Which is an expensive extra layer of bureaucracy from my point of view, especially in this economic climate. And there was no response from the group, which included deans and faculty, and Ned was on there and other people too. And then finally somebody piped up and said, well, the chancellor wants it. That's not a good enough reason.
Yeah. Right.
That's not good enough.
Yeah.
I'm
Does
sorry.
she know something we don't know? I mean, you know, that's that's the idea, you know. Fascinating. But yeah, let me play another one from Jerry's interview, a segment. This speaks to things that we have already mentioned, but I think I want to underscore that. So it was about like, you know, cutting lectureships and so forth.
The campus and the college will be tempted to cut lectureships and to cut graduate assistantships because they're the easiest thing to do operationally and politically. But it's probably the least efficient thing to do. The lectureships cost us very little, generates enormous amounts of tuition dollars. There's actually, that's one of the few parts of our operations which generates an operational profit. Just look at summer session, which is very profitable. So I think that those would be mistakes. The graduate students are extremely qualified. We pay them very little, and we get lots of services out of them. I think that would be also a very inefficient and unwise choice would be to cut that because it is the most expedient. We should probably think hard about the vertical cuts, but it's difficult to do that in the short run. All right, it has to be planned out, I think, in advance. And I think these program reviews should have been done earlier on, and a plan for reorganizing or cutting units should be done in good times and then executed at this time. So right now, by the time they figure out what to cut and do so efficiently, the budget crisis will be over. So they'll end up cutting in a haphazard manner. Because that's just the expedient thing to do. Where's the money? Anywhere that it is, just take it.
So we just have like a little bit time left, and I want to do at least one more show on the budget cuts because I think are very important. So this will be next year in February, the first of the first show in the semester next year. So you know we'll be revisiting this. But any quick discussion, views, ideas, Richard?
Well, you know, only need to reiterate what we've said before. You know, there's the in terms of vertical cuts, the notion that here we sit in the middle of the Pacific, 3,000 miles away from the next university. You know, does that mean it's incumbent upon us to provide every area for people to study within the islands? Can we afford it? And this has to do as well with the discussion we've already had at West Oahu. And secondly, the other issue is the centrality of, for example, liberal arts, the least well-funded in terms of faculty, resources, outside grants. And as we've already seen, the facility with which it is, you know, people take it upon themselves to make cuts of lectures, instructors, ultimately very destructive.
Yeah, so Noel, anything?
Let's use this as an opportunity to redefine ourselves as a great university and to really improve what we do. You know, crisis, opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the idea, threats, you know, and opportunities, right, yeah. So anyway, we're about flat out of time actually now. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our viewers. Happy New Year, and see you next year. Mahalo.